history fans. I'm going to go over our last 10 important dates from World War II. And I'm going to start with June 22nd, 1941, which is Operation Barbarossa. This is Hitler's invasion of Russia. And this is a big deal because there's a little bit of betrayal involved. Hitler and Stalin had 2 years earlier signed a non aggression pact to basically clear the way for the invasion and occupation of Poland by both sides. But Hitler had made his promise not to attack Russia. Russia had made its promise not to attack Hitler. And so between Hitler and Stalin, whom can you trust? Well, it turns out Hitler was the first to break his word, and so he carried out this invasion of Russia. Initially very successful, but in the long run, he was about to discover what Napoleon had discovered when he invaded Russia over 130 years earlier, and that was Russia is big, Russia is cold, and the Russians fight like animals when their backs are to the wall. And the retreat for both armies from Russia is going to lead them to being mauled by angry Russian troops all the way back to their home country. So Hitler is about to discover that. It's going to be a couple of years before he finds that out. But the Blitzkrieg tactic does not work as well in Russia, simply because Russia is huge and can actually absorb a blitzkrieg, something that Poland and France could not do. Now, next up, August 18, 1942. This is the Doolittle raid, the Tokyo raid, same thing. And this was a brilliantly conceived mission by, well, at the time, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who already was an aviation celebrity. And as a lieutenant colonel in the Army Air Force, he collaborated with the Navy to come up with a plan to launch 16 medium bombers off of the USS Hornet. And to cut a long and very exciting story short, the result was that the bombers got within range of the Japanese mainland in early 1942. This is just 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they actually dropped some American bombs on Japanese soil. This was not a militarily consequential raid, but a great morale booster because America saw that, we're still in the fight. And it did cause the Japanese to withdraw some of their aviation assets from around the Pacific back closer to the homeland to provide better protection for the Japanese islands. So this was an indirect consequence of it, but a great morale booster for America. That was our beginning to get back after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Next up, June 4 to 7, 1942, Midway. You remember Yamamoto's prediction that he could run wild for 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. After that, he had no expectation of success. And what happened 6 months later? Midway. And the Battle of Midway hinges on a commander of a flight of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers. Wade McCluskey makes a decision to pursue a certain direction for about 15 minutes because at that point his men would be low on gas and they would need to turn back and return to their carrier. Well, that random direction on the compass that he chose led the American dive bombers out over the Japanese fleet at their most vulnerable moment. So American dive bombers plunged into the attack, dropping bombs on the decks of wooden aircraft carriers. Where were the Japanese fighters providing air cover? They were down on the decks of those carriers getting refueled. So were their dive bombers. So were their torpedo bombers. The decks were cluttered with fuel hoses, ordnance such as bombs and torpedoes and ammunition. And once a couple of American bombs went off, the secondary explosions did the rest. In a matter of minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were out of the fight. Those three carriers were done for. Hiryu was severely damaged, and in a second strike, Hiryu would be sunk. The Japanese lose four aircraft carriers in moments. Well, they lose three very quickly, and they lose the fourth one later on in the battle. And from there on, the tide of battle changes in favor of the Allies, and Allied initiative is ours from that point onward. Interesting thing: the Battle of Midway was fought on both sides of the international date line, and in the Battle of Midway, no surface vessel saw a surface vessel of the enemy fleet. All the combat was done by air or by submarine, primarily by air. And so it was possible, because of the international date line, for an American fighter plane to leave today to go attack a Japanese ship tomorrow and to return yesterday. It's a little bit weird, but those are the strange things that happen going back and forth over the international date line. And I hope I got that yesterday, today, and tomorrow thing right. We do know Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's for certain. So that's the good news. Now, next up, Battle of Stalingrad. Oh, Hitler had attacked too deeply into Russia, and his logistics were bogged down and compromised, so that German soldiers were not getting in large enough amounts and in a timely fashion the supplies that they needed. So the German Sixth Army had taken over the city of Stalingrad. Today it's called Volgograd, but at the time Stalingrad. And Hitler was determined to concentrate his forces on Stalingrad in the south of Russia, and on Leningrad in the north of Russia. Leningrad today is St. Petersburg, and that's what it was before it was Leningrad. But for World War II, the battles are Leningrad in the north, Stalingrad in the south. If you go there today, it's St. Petersburg in the north and Volgograd in the south. So Hitler believed that these were cities of spiritual importance, and that taking those cities was going to destroy Russian morale and the Russian will to fight, showing how little he knew of Russians and how badly he underestimated Slavic peoples. So while his generals were urging him to attack Moscow, where most of the industry was and where railroad junctions were, that would have been extremely disruptive to the Russian war effort, Hitler insisted on those two cities. And on February 2nd, 1943, Field Marshal von Paulus walks over to his Russian counterparts and surrenders his Sixth Army. There's more to the story of that than that. More of Hitler's micromanaging and more of the foolish orders that he issued that made it impossible for von Paulus to save his army otherwise. But from that point onward, the Russians are in command of the situation, and they are pushing the Germans all the way back to Germany, similarly to what they did with Napoleon earlier, and in another age. And so these Russian troops are discovering evidences of Nazi atrocities as they go. Villages that have been destroyed, civilians that have been murdered, and the anger and rage that is filling the Red Army is a factor that makes their pursuit of the German Wehrmacht unstoppable. Well, that brings us next to a conference. Now, how exciting can a conference be? Isn't that just a bunch of old guys sitting around and talking about stuff? Well, important decisions are made at conferences, and these decisions are instrumental in determining where our limited resources to conduct war are going to be prioritized. How are we going to wage this war? Where are we going to fight? There's a tremendous amount that comes out of these conferences. There were a few during World War II, but I'm homing in on Casablanca, a conference held with Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, and Franklin Roosevelt of the United States. And those the so-called Big Three made the decision that they would accept only unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. That's a big deal because unconditional surrender is, in my mind, how you actually win wars. You don't really win a war by leaving a hostile regime and its government in power. You demand the absolute capitulation. Churchill's view of warfare was decisive defeat of the enemy and then generosity to the enemy afterwards. Stalin wanted retribution. He wanted numbers of German civilians to be rounded up and simply executed. Churchill objected strenuously to that idea, and so after the Second World War was over, we kind of follow the Churchill model rather than the Versailles model after World War One, and we put all of our resources to rebuilding our defeated enemies, rebuilding Germany, well, West Germany, rebuilding Japan, and we end up making friends out of former enemies, and they are allies of ours to this day. So Churchill was right on that count. But Casablanca, unconditional surrender. That's what comes out of that. June 6, 1944, is the D-Day invasion. This is Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe. This is, to this day, the largest invasion in human history. There were literally millions of military personnel involved. This begins with ships starting up in Scotland and beginning to make their way southward down the British coastline to rendezvous with other ships as they were coming out and to create this monstrous flotilla, if we can call it a flotilla, of ships, this monstrous fleet that made its way southward across the English Channel and landed at Normandy and achieved tactical surprise. That was the amazing thing. We knew we were going to invade Europe. The Germans knew we were going to invade Europe. We knew we were going to land somewhere in France. They knew we were going to land somewhere in France. One of their most capable generals, General Erwin Rommel, was in command of defending the French, the German-held French territory, and so Rommel made a decision. He knew, okay, the Allies are going to invade, but probably not this week. So I think I'm going to go to Berlin and surprise my wife on her birthday. And he was out of town when he was most needed. So Germany's most capable general, arguably at least one of their most capable generals of the time, was simply not available to provide the necessary direction to counterattack and try to push off the Allied invasion. So another providential blessing there. So we establish a beachhead in France and we begin our movement towards Germany. At the same time, Russian troops that have already won at Stalingrad are pushing from the other side. And so we have two jaws of a vice, an Allied jaw and a Soviet jaw, uh, pressuring together and crushing the Nazi war effort in between. That brings us to December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Now, this requires some explanation because people wonder, hey, where's that bulge they were fighting over? Okay, the bulge is not a geographical feature. The bulge is a battle line on a map. Imagine a relatively straight line, as you see here, and imagine that as you're looking at this, we have German troops attacking the Allied lines, pushing them back, causing a slight bulge in the line. And there is, of course, danger of a German breakout. And if the Germans do break out, that could at least set us back several months, or the worst case scenario, and at that point, not a likely one, but a real worst case scenario would be the loss of everything that had been gained up till that point, and then starting back from scratch again. That probably wouldn't have happened, but it was a significant enough threat, and so elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne are surrounded by German forces. They fight heroically. They fight with good old American Yankee ingenuity, probably some good old redneck ingenuity as well. And the result is that that territory is held until good weather prevails. Massive airstrikes can be carried out on German supply lines, and that territory can be quickly regained, and the offensive towards Germany resumed. So that dash through Belgium, that attempt to break the Allied lines, was Hitler's last best effort, and it ultimately failed. Have some interesting quotes from that battle. I'm not sure they're appropriate for our purposes, but there are some quotes very, very expressive of American determination. Uh, okay, so moving on. May 8, 1945, by this time Hitler has committed suicide. He married his well, not lifelong mistress, but mistress of several years, Eva Braun, and then the two committed suicide shortly after they were married. The bodies were going to be disposed of, in one account as to why we don't have the remains of Adolf Hitler. Hitler and Eva Braun's corpses were taken outside of the bunker in which they were hiding, and they were going to be disposed of, and a stray Russian artillery shell pretty much finished the job. So no tangible remains of Hitler have been found since then. And so on May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. Admiral Karl Donitz becomes the effective Fuhrer of Germany for a couple of days, and then it is he who surrenders to the Allied forces. Now, we're still in the fight because Japan is still an enemy, and we are still fighting our way back across the island by island, getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland. And the Japanese do not fight like the Germans. The Germans, they have an idea that, okay, the war is over and it's just time to surrender and go back and rebuild the country and try to get back on with life. The Japanese are not thinking that way. To them, their emperor is a god, and one of the greatest things that you can look forward to is dying for your god, because if you die a happy death, you come back as a happy spirit. It's in their Shinto belief, and so the Japanese fight more ardently as we get closer to the sacred Japanese islands, which to them were created by Izanagi and Izanami as they stood on the floating bridge of heaven, and Izanagi dipped his spear into the waters and shook off the droplets, and they formed the Japanese island. So this is the belief that is motivating an extraordinary degree of fanaticism with the Japanese soldiers. And so there is on the drawing board plans for Operation Downfall. Because of the way the Japanese had been fighting, it was believed that an invasion of the Japanese islands would result in at least 1 million Allied casualties, 1 million Allied dead and wounded. And of course, that would necessarily mean a larger number of Japanese casualties as well. In the meantime, we had been developing an atomic bomb. Most people in that field knew that an atomic bomb was possible, and we made it happen. We had actually detonated a successful atomic bomb in New Mexico, and realized that we didn't have the potential for this weapon. We had the weapon. And so at this point, President Roosevelt has died. Harry Truman is president, and he makes a decision, controversial to this day, to drop those two atomic bombs. And on the in the big view of things, it is argued by those who favored the dropping of the atomic bombs that it did shorten the war. It ultimately did save many more lives than an invasion would have cost. And if that came out, in other words, an invasion would have cost a lot more in human life than the dropping of two atomic bombs. Was there another good option? Well, maybe you can think of one. But at the time, it was, we've got to end this war, and this seems to be a very persuasive way to do it quickly and effectively. So August 6, 1945, um, we have Little Boy, a uranium bomb that is dropped over the city of Hiroshima. And in a culture where many of the houses are wooden, the effect of the bomb was absolutely devastating. And 3 days later, we have the dropping of the Fat Man, a plutonium bomb dropped on Hiroshima, I'm sorry, on Nagasaki, and likewise with devastating results. And so the Japanese Emperor Hirohito decides it is time to surrender. And so the uh, on September 2nd, 1945, the war comes to an end. Now, if you take the typical dates for the beginning and the end of World War II, if you can remember September 1 and September 2, you can remember September 1, 1939, the invasion of Poland that starts the war, and you can remember September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered to the Allies. Well, that wraps it up, and we'll be back with more.